Hello, hello, beautiful humans. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm excited to be here. Excited to share with you a really special guest. Sharyn Holmes is here today, and we're going to be talking about leadership for Black, Indigenous women of color. Really excited about this interview. Sharyn comes from Australia, and I don't know, as an American, I don't know much about the conversation about liberation in Australia, and I tend to get the feeling that Australians, Canadians, British people tend to think that they're somehow absolved from the sins of the slaughtering of Indigenous and Black people, and obviously they're not. And so I loved bringing Sharyn Holmes on because she shared some of her perspective as an Australian and what work still needs to be done in Australia, as well as, this conversation is really centered for Black, Indigenous women of color of what does leadership and power look like. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thaís Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. But before I get into that, a couple really exciting announcements. Yesterday, today, but yesterday, whatever, I launched my newest ebook, Reclaiming Worth. That's right. I have a new ebook. It's called Reclaiming Worth. It is 50 pages of all of the most important content about what it means to heal your worthiness wound and get out of your own way. I also recorded a meditation just for the ebook. Honestly, this meditation is one of my faves. It's all about accessing worthiness within, as well as some journal prompts to guide you and support you in the conversation of what does it mean for you to cultivate habits of worth. So you can go to thaissky.com/worth to sign up, or you can just go to the show notes. Hundreds of you have already downloaded this ebook, which really excites me. I've already gotten some really cool feedback saying that this was really informative and useful and helpful. I shared some of my thoughts about this ebook on my Instagram story. So you can go to Instagram and find me at I am Thaís Sky to learn more about the back end of creating this workbook. I'm just really excited about launching this ebook into the world because it also signals that we are officially in worthiness season. If you've been here with me over the past few years, you know that I have worthiness season twice a year. Well, I'm setting myself up so that worthiness season is actually going to be only coming probably about once a year moving forward. And it's a dedicated amount of time where I'm going to be talking specifically about worthiness and learning how to tend to the places within us that feel inadequate and broken, so that we can really reclaim the woman that we were born to be, right? The whole human that we were born to be. Because I navigate the worthiness wound. This has been a wound that has debilitated me over my lifetime. And it has felt oftentimes really painful. The story that I am too much or that I am not enough, right? Those are the opposite sides of the same thing, which is the worthiness wound. And it's a really painful wound to carry, to feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough. And yes, you can do mindset work. You can do kind of states of being where you can change your belief systems about things. But I haven't found that really substantially changes the worthiness wound because it's an emotional wound. It's happening in a different place in our brain. And so this ebook and the subsequent content that I'm going to share over the next few weeks are going to be about how can we start to really shift that. I also have so many surprises coming your way. So much good stuff happening over the next few weeks as we go deep into worthiness season, because doors are open for my group program, Worthy Women Rise. And for the first time ever, this program is going to be a year long. I'm just really excited to invite in women who want to do this work for a longer period of time. Women who know that the type of healing that they crave, the type of expressiveness, freedom, expansion, joy, love that they crave is going to come from a longer commitment with themselves and with a community of women. I'm really excited to offer this type of healing space, because I know that this is what works, right? Like the Worthy Women Rise was built off of a model I created, the Worthiness Wound model, which is evidence-based, trauma-informed, step-by-step process in which we can slowly heal and tend to the worthiness wound. So this program was built off of that, and I just keep seeing that like we need more time with this model in order for it to really steep into our lives and create the lasting changes that we want. So if you're interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to worthywomenrise.com to learn more. You can apply. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me at info@thaissky.com. This program is going to be the most powerful experience for women who want to really reclaim their worth and also cultivate like emotional mastery, right? Who want to access their sensitivity in a way that feels accessible. Women who want to cultivate deeper intimacy in their lives. Women who want to learn how to advocate for themselves, to have needs, to take up space, all of that. Okay, so go to worthywomenrise.com to learn more and go to thaissky.com/worth to get the ebook. Okay. Without further ado, let's bring on Sharyn Holmes. Here is her bio. Sharyn Holmes is a biracial Asian, founder of Formidable Voices, an events, membership, and social movement, elevating and creating opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and women of color across coaching, spirituality, wellness, creativity, and online business industries. Sharyn is a leadership and inclusion coach, consultant, speaker, artist, and writer. Her work dives deep into social justice, spirituality, and personal sovereignty. Sharyn is passionate about anti-racism, creating inclusive spaces, conscious business strategy, creativity, and self-expression, and works as a consultant to small businesses in these areas. Sharyn created the Unpack Your Privilege to Formidable Business and Inclusion Framework. She teaches the online anti-racist and anti-oppression course Unpack Your Privilege, and she also teaches a program called Be an Inclusive Coach. She leads online circles, gutsy leadership circles, guiding women leaders to bring sacred activism to the heart of their work and lives and businesses, and Dissent Circle on shadow work, sovereignty, and soul. Woo! This woman does a lot. You can learn more about her at gutsygirl.com.au. I love this conversation I have with Sharyn about leadership for Black, Indigenous, and women of color. Can't wait to hear your feedback on it. Let's bring this interview to fruition, and I will see you all next week. Okay, hello, Sharyn. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast.
Hi, Thaís. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I've been a follower of your work. I don't know how we got connected on social media, but I've always been a big admirer of your work and your voice, and you're just, I just sense a lot of fire from you, which resonates a lot with my own fire, and I'm just endlessly appreciative of everything that you do online. And so for people who are new to you, could you offer just a little bit about what you do, who you are, how you identify, etc.?
Oh, thank you. I'm just trying to think of the shortest way possible to describe myself. I guess first and foremost, I'm all about social change, social entrepreneurship, and conscious business, and supporting entrepreneurs and small business owners to be mindful about anti-racism and anti-oppression, for them to create inclusive businesses. And I do this through coaching, consulting, and courses. In terms of how I would describe myself, first and foremost, I'm a mother. The work that I do is very much about sacred activism, and in that space of connecting the spiritual with social justice work. What else? It's really hard to sort of sum it up in just a few words, but I'm just here to I really want to see some real positive change in the world before I die. And the work that I do every day is with that vision in mind, you know, to not live a half life, to live a full life, and to do that in full service of others, and primarily Black, Indigenous women and people of colour.
I love it. I love it. Really appreciate your work. And one of the reasons why I reached out to you is I actually haven't done a lot of education on the ways in which Australia uh, participates in white supremacy. And I imagine that, well, I don't imagine, I know that white supremacy is everywhere in the world, but being so United States centric, I think it's also a thing about living in the United States. You do become so consumed by being in the United States that you tend to think that the world revolves around us. It doesn't, surprisingly.
Mhm.
But I actually know very little about Australian history and the way it is there now. And one of the things that when I reached out to you about what we wanted to talk about in the podcast, you sent me an email where you basically said that Australia has had access to anti-racism resources for a long time, and that the settlement of white Australia is taught in school even as early as the 1990s, and the history of Aboriginal Australia is widely covered in the media. And so there are a lot of conversations in Australia about colonization that isn't really taught here in the United States. So I was surprised to hear that, Sharyn, because I know that racism still runs rampant in Australia. And I, initially as a white woman would imagine, well, education is the answer. And if there's education, there's progress, there's changes. And in basically one paragraph in your email, you blew that out of my mind. I mean, my mind is like completely like twisting, because it really grounded me in my whiteness and the fact that, wait, maybe education is one piece, but certainly not the piece that's going to lead to change, because even the education in Australia isn't doing it, the system's justice.
Yeah, no, that's correct. Education is just one small piece. Obviously, we need an education in order to change our beliefs when we've been conditioned by whiteness and where white supremacy has been at the forefront. And Australia is a colonised country. The traditional owners have experienced hundreds of years of intergenerational trauma and racism, and the system really needs to be altered and changed, preferably dismantled, in order for the Aboriginal people of this country to receive what they deserve. And that hasn't been the case for 232 years now.
Wow.
Australia is a young country, obviously, by comparison to when the land known as United States was settled. So Australia has had the opportunity to do things differently, and it hasn't, because it was very much embedded in the leaders and government of the colonisers that arrived here. It was written into the White Australia policy, how anyone who wasn't white was going to be treated. Australia has a history of slavery, many massacres of Aboriginal people, and genocide, obviously. The Aboriginal population in Australia is 3% today. So that gives you a really good indication of
Wow.
how, and the population of Australia is 25 million, just to put it into context. That just gives you a really good picture of what's happened to the Aboriginal people in Australia. Yeah. And how small a population it is. And always we must prioritise the most marginalised, and that's not happening. That's not happening in a just, positive, supportive way in Australia, and that needs to change. And I'm no expert in Aboriginal culture, but I can just see from what I've examined, what I learned in high school and what I learned in primary school as early as grade 3, when we talked about Aboriginal people and what happened, right through to now, where I've actually done my own exploration and further study to understand what went on. And that education has helped me really have a very wide perspective of the system and what needs to change. And so everything I do is always to support and prioritise the most marginalised. And in terms of Australia, there's definitely more that I could be doing, even though I do this kind of work every day.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how Canada, United Kingdom, Australia tends to look at the United States and think that's not us.
Yeah.
like, oh, thank God we don't have that. Oh, those people who participated in slavery, that's never us. We didn't do that. And yet, it sounds like you all, have had your own history of oppression, as the United Kingdom has. Of course, they were the originators, as well
That's
as
right.
right, as well as Canada. And so I think this is something that I've continually become really curious about. For me, is like, where am I othering? Where am I saying, oh, at least I'm not that? And where am I then taking that moment to bring that inwards to say, how am I like that? How am I more similar to that than I want to admit?
And self-awareness is the first step.
Yeah.
And it can be really, really uncomfortable, obviously.
Yeah. And so, let's shift the conversation a little bit and just talk about, leadership, because this is the bread and butter of your work. This is what you're basically all about, is like amplification of leadership and what it means to be a leader and what it means to, like make actual changes instead of just talking about change. And I'm curious, like, how did you land into this work? What about this work really pulls you and activates you? Like, tell me about your purpose, Sharyn.
Well, for me personally, my purpose has always come through my own experiences and what I observe and the empathy and compassion I have for others. And I'll tell you a little story about something that happened to me at work a few years ago, where I'd already recognized maybe 6 years ago that there was a lack of representation in the corporate company that I was in, of marginalized people in senior roles. And I tried to be proactive with in trying to further my own career. And the advice I received was basically Sheryl Sandberg's book, To Lean In. And I leaned in. And I did everything that I was told to do in order to get ahead. And as it turns out, obviously I can't lean in if I'm not a white woman and if I'm not a white man in the industry, in the company that I worked for. And I leaned in and nothing came of it. And this is the thing about white-led organizations, white-led courses and programs. They're not designed for marginalized people. And as a woman of color, I'll speak from my perspective, they're not designed for women of color like me to become leaders, because we have to assimilate and become whatever whiteness deems worthy in order to get those roles. And even that's not guaranteed. So I did all the things and it didn't come to fruition. And so I really noticed the disparity there with the lack of opportunities when it came to leadership in the corporate structure for women of color, and just overall, particularly Black, Indigenous women of color in the companies that I worked in. And so combined with that, the experience of the gender bias, the racial bias, microaggressions that happened in the workplace, so racist encounters, I started to see how the work I was doing outside of my job, because I was doing holding circles and running workshops for women, how I might be able to unite the two. And that led me on to a journey about my identity. Who am I? Why do I feel like I don't belong? And I'm biracial. So my dad's Northern Irish and my mum's Chinese Indonesian. And I'm first generation born in Australia, and I'm an only child. I don't have another example of someone like me with my upbringing, with my background. So the sense of not belonging stemmed from childhood and teenhood, where I was told I wasn't Australian and to go back to my own country. So you can see from many decades, I'm 43, decades throughout my life, this feeling of not belonging, not good enough, where do I fit? Where do I fit exactly? And trying to fit in hasn't worked. So what can I do where I don't have to fit in? And surely there are other people around the world like me who also don't feel like they belong, also don't fit cultural norms, the standards of whiteness. So my work has evolved into, one, obviously educating people about anti-racism and anti-oppression and how to be inclusive and create equitable businesses in that regard. But more than that, it's about creating leadership opportunities, creating visibility opportunities, and highlighting and elevating the work of Black, Indigenous women of colour, particularly in the coaching, wellness, and personal development industries.
Yeah.
So that's basically where my client base comes from.
It's amazing at even just the concept of lean in, right? This idea that, what was it, Sheryl Sandberg wrote, the COO of Facebook, when she wrote that book. It was really interesting to see this huge wave of women being like, yes, this is the answer. And then an undercurrent of women, particularly Black and Indigenous women of color, saying, wait a minute. This doesn't work for all women. Don't speak for all women. You're speaking about white women's empowerment, because we can't lean in because we can't change the color of our skin. And that's what you're asking. That's what needs to happen in order for us to be accepted in leadership positions. So I love that you mentioned that, because I think that, there's so many ways in which empowerment nowadays can make it seem like they're speaking to all of us, when really, if it's not connected to systemic change, it's really only speaking to white women.
Yes, correct. It's interesting when I put the pieces together about how my feelings about identity proved to me that I could follow all of the instructions. I could come out of my shell as I was told. And I guess the worst piece of advice I ever received, which I didn't take when I was in that corporation, was play the gender card and cry.
Wow.
Yeah. So I realized that I don't have to try and fit in. I don't have to assimilate. I can choose. I can choose not to be different. I can choose not to be unlike myself. So I just decided to choose me. And in choosing me, that means that I can guide others to choose themselves too. So I define myself. And one thing that's happened, certainly because of the lack of representation of Black, Indigenous, women of colour leaders in the industries that I work in, it means you don't get invited very often, particularly if you make waves, particularly if you communicate in the way that I do with my writing. You don't get invited. And if you are invited, some of those invitations are tokenistic, because there's this desire for optical inclusion, as though that is enough, and that's not enough. And so in terms of the table, you can extend your table to include Black, Indigenous women of colour, but you need to do so much deep work, from the self-awareness right through to the inclusion work, in order for that to be genuine, authentic, and acceptable. So I decided that I would build my own table. Not just a table for me, but a collective table, a collective table where I can encourage and inspire and motivate and support women of colour who identify with me, or who get strength from the words that I write, because I want to see us all thrive. And I believe that Black, Indigenous, and women of colour have a multitude of qualities and talents and gifts to share, and I want to be one of the people that helps to elevate us.
Yeah, I think that that's wonderful. And I imagine that what whiteness does is, wherever you go, you're kind of expected to educate, and expected to do the emotional labor of making everybody comfortable about your otherness, especially, Sharyn, because of your kind of grounded in your otherness, right? Like, you are proud to be a woman of color. You're not trying to be white. And I think what tends to make people of color palatable to white people is their desire to be white, right? Through behavior or speech or whatever. And so how do you support women of color really claim their otherness in a culture that really wants women of color to become white, or to shift into whiteness, or at least to idealize whiteness?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. When I think about the work that I've done in my coaching business with women of color, it's really about really grounding into our gifts and really looking at what are we good at, what do we enjoy, what are we joyful about, what are we passionate about when it comes to our work, and obviously moving towards what do we really, really want to do. And sometimes those things that we really want to do, we think that they're so out of reach because perhaps there isn't an example for us to follow. Perhaps we feel like we don't have the confidence to do that because that would be doing something unique and different. And so the work I do is all about encouraging and supporting the women that I work with to take in all of their experience, their professional experience, what they've learned, what they're interested in, and also their lived experience, because there is a lot from our earliest memory onwards that we can take on board and we can bring with us as being part of who we are, obviously, but also what we can do in terms of the world. So who we serve, how we serve, and what we bring to the table that we decide to build. So I really focus on the mastery aspect of what are the strengths that the women I work with have. What would they love to do? I find that purpose is only true purpose is only really possible if you get to do something you really love, not just what you're really good at, because you've got a growth edge there when you kind of go, I would really love to do this, and that's sort of where you can kind of ascend, and then what you're good at is just that's where you can trust that you have the confidence and the abilities to do what it is that you would like to do. So that's the sort of transformational part of how I support the women that I work with.
I love that. I think it's so strength-based and grounded in this spaciousness that we all get to thrive in our lives and in our pursuit of living, and even in systems that don't have space for us, we get to really find what works for us, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Find what works for you. If there is something that you would really like to do, and you can't see it being created for women like yourself, then go out there and create that. Obviously, you might not feel up to doing that solo, but you can always ask for support and work with someone that is wanting to support you in that pursuit of what it is that you would most like to achieve and most like to do with your life.
I love that. And, I'm always struck when I'm in a space, being in my whiteness and waking up to my whiteness, being in a space where I'm looking around and it's predominantly white, and then I see a few trickle of people of color in that space. And sometimes I really try to just hold for a minute what that must be like. Growing up in Brazil and living in Japan, I have been around people of color most of my life, and then moving to the United States and living in a small suburban town. Even though I went to kind of the inner city school, I surrounded myself predominantly people that looked like me, and that's my story of waking up to my own whiteness. And the privilege of that, and the comfort that I get to have because I'm surrounding myself with people, and I don't have to figure out how to fit myself into a space that I'm not, as long as we're not talking about gender, because I know there's intersectionality there with the gender. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what are your thoughts, or what are some things that women of color can kind of ground themselves in when it comes to being in these predominant white spaces, to not feel the burden of having to do that education, of the burden of having to be that token person of color, that burden that white people place to stand up, to be a monolith, right? To take a stand for all people of color. How do you combat that? Like, how do you navigate that on a daily basis?
it's a daily reminder to be proud of who you are,
Mm.
and proud of how far you've come, and proud of everyone in your lineage who survived so that you could be here.
I mean, I just really need to breathe with that because that's really potent. Yeah.
And there's for some of us, there was a fair bit to overcome to get to that being proud of who, to be proud of who we are, for me to be proud of who I am. It took me a long time. I was in my late 30s when I started to believe in that and started to really believe in myself.
Yeah. What was that journey
And
for you?
it's interesting. My identity journey really came from my experience of becoming a mum 14 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the portal, the gateway to me looking at the world through all of my experiences, all of my lived experiences of racism, and sexism and misogyny and other experiences that I had, and looking at the world and going, what kind of world do I want to be here to shape for my daughter? And what have I been willing to accept up until this point that I wouldn't want her to have to live through for decades like I did? And by extension of that, what don't I want all girls to not experience? What do I want Black, Indigenous, and women of colour, and girls of colour to experience? I want them to be able to feel confident and proud of who they are, and willing to do what it is that to follow their dreams. And sometimes following your dreams can take you on lots of different pathways, and sometimes you have to restart and try again. But for me, when I think about that, I think how I don't feel like I wasted my time in previous decades. I just feel like if I had been guided sooner, or if there was some example of how things could be, or then perhaps it would have happened for me earlier. But rather than thinking about regret or what could have been, I think about what could I do that's going to support women and girls of colour to get to feeling proud of themselves much earlier than I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're really speaking also to like a worthiness piece, the way I teach about the worthiness wound
Yeah, totally.
in Worthy Women Rise is that the more marginalized identities we carry, the more of a worthiness wound we are a risk factor to having. It's not that necessarily we have a bigger worthiness wound because there are other factors at play, but it certainly opens you up to having more worthiness wound, because it's one thing to have had, a difficult experience of feeling unworthy, and another to be told by these large systems that you are unworthy, that you are insignificant, that you don't matter, you shouldn't exist. And to overcome that is to rise, is to claim sovereignty, is to claim your own valid human experience.
Yes, completely. And when you invited me to be on your podcast, it was like, yes, worthiness is just such a big piece for me, because you have to start feeling like you're worthy of exploring unworthiness before you can actually even start to claim that, yes, you are worthy. So when you invited me, I was like, I'd love to be able to have this conversation. And obviously there are different stories that can be told that are linked to that. But that's definitely a piece of it as well. Like the worthiness wound has been really, a really big one to overcome, and to continually remind myself that I am worthy of what I'm doing. I'm worthy of taking up space. I'm worthy of creating a new space. All of those things linked to where and how I might feel worthy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell me. I would love to hear a story if you're willing to share about what this looks like for you and navigating this.
Okay. Probably the biggest, I guess, most constant message that I have conditioned myself into believing I'm not going to say I believed it like heart and soul. I'm going to say I was conditioned into believing it. And with all of the layers that we've already spoken about as well. And it taps into sort of that imposter type complex as well, in terms of before I started doing my work, the work that I do now, which evolved over, a period of 8 years to become what it is now. And I was obviously working in corporate up until about just over 2 years ago. And I had worked for how many years? 23 years, 24 years in corporate companies. It was that feeling of, I was always questioning whether I was qualified. And for much of my working life, I did so without a degree, and I still don't have a degree. And everywhere I worked, I was always a fast learner, a quick learner. I love to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. I don't think I will ever stop reading or learning or exploring or researching. And so I learned everything I know on the job, and then through my own, motivation to be better and to do more. And some of that obviously would stem from worthiness, feeling like I have to play catch up because I don't have a degree. And I guess in terms of the imposter complex, I would work with people who had degrees, sometimes multiple degrees, sometimes MBAs, and we were doing exactly the same job. And I was competent in doing the jobs that I was doing, but I always felt like I was unqualified because of who I was comparing myself with. And it wasn't until, and it took me, when I decided to change, or to, I guess, evolve my business from teaching women about sacred leadership and moving more into talking about anti-racism and social justice and social change. It took me probably a solid 6 to 8 months of questioning myself. Am I qualified to do this? Am I qualified to do this? Am I worthy of being paid for this work? That was a big piece. Am I worthy to claim, to be paid for this work? So that was 6 to 8 months of ruminating. I was still working at my day job, and I was still doing stuff online and in my business, doing a lot of writing, and those questions were still there. So it took me obviously a while. It seemed short, 6 to 8 months of ruminating over that. Really, it was a whole lifetime with all of the layers of, I'm not qualified. I've been doing these jobs over this period of time in my career, and I'm still comparing myself to other people when we're both achieving same results. We're both performing, we're performing the same. We still get the same outcome in our performance review. I was still doing that whole comparison, imposter, am I worthy thing. And I just got sick of myself. How could I go through all of this through my working life with all of the layers of my experience, in lived experience of racial trauma, and other forms of trauma, PTSD and anxiety, and still feel like I'm not worthy of receiving or doing what I most wish to do. So I guess this explains the purpose part. I'm really passionate about the work that I do, but I had to work really hard to feel worthy to do it, to start writing and talking about it, and then 3, to start charging for it. And I really have to say a massive thank you to Stacey Jordan Shelton, because she really helped me with the worthiness piece over my feeling underqualified. So that changed everything for me, and that was only like this time last year. So
that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I think it's just so real, and I think it reflects so many people's sentiment around what it means for them to charge for their work and to put themselves out there. And that worthiness piece, I mean, I just see it everywhere. is a really important component of leadership. And so thank you so much for sharing that story, Sharyn. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
What do what is your number one kind of advice or thoughts that you offer people of color, women of color, who are attempting to rise in the ranks or put themselves out there in a bigger way as a leader, and are feeling their, that worthiness wound, or feeling that piece of, I'm not good enough to be doing this work?
Well, it takes a village. You can hermit away and work in your own little shell like I did, talking myself out of it, talking myself into it. But it does take a village. So having trusted friends, trusted advisors, people who understand your identity, your identities, the many layers of your identities, and also your layered experiences and your lived experiences of racism. Really, for someone who gets you, to have someone like that in your corner is really, really valuable, because you can, like I said, you can do it on your own. A lot of my personal healing work that I've done, I did a lot of it for years on my own because of the shame of feeling like, do I really want to talk to someone about this? And is anyone going to understand? And I have to say, the reason why I bring up shame, the reason why I bring up is someone going to understand, is because I did speak to people. I did seek help with regards to how I was feeling in years prior. And I couldn't get that understanding, not from the white women that I was seeing, therapists, counselors. I couldn't get what I needed. And so that's why I say that it's so important to have an advisor or a coach or a counselor that gets all of the layers of your identity, and who can maybe relate with some of your experiences and the challenges that you're having, because they're the people who are going to help you get through, overcome the obstacles and be able to rise into your full power. You can do it on your own, but it's a really lonely, hard road. And having people, multiple people, if you can, to motivate and encourage you really helps a lot.
Yeah, I love that. I am always struck by the potency of kind of self-healing, right? Reading the books, the journaling, and like how much that can be so important. And I think sometimes, because of kind of like our individualistic culture, it's easier to promote this sense that you kind of have to figure things out by yourself and you have to do this healing work by yourself. And if you don't do it by yourself, it means that you're weak. And so I really appreciate you highlighting that actually, we get to be doing this together, and we get to get support if we want support. And that's one of the most, for me personally, has been one of the most instrumental parts of my own healing, is seeking that support and getting support from somebody.
Yes, it's okay to ask for help.
Exactly. Yes. So as we're wrapping up, any other final thoughts or comments?
I'd like to bring up a couple of things for Black, Indigenous women of colour who are interested in leadership, no matter which industry it's in. And it goes back to what I said before about looking at your strengths and your abilities and what you're really good at, and really owning those things. And just a few of the things that, as Black, Indigenous women of colour, that skills and qualities that we have that set us apart, that really can support us to thrive and succeed as leaders are, we understand how to lead across different cultures, because we've had to equally be part of our own communities as well as being part of other cultures and assimilating into other cultures. So we have a lot of breadth to our experience in that we are competent in navigating different cultural spaces, And we can obviously, from that and the many experiences we've had, we can see multiple perspectives as well. We can really look at things on a big picture scale, and not just solely about our own identity. We can actually we have a really good understanding of other people's identities and cultural identities as well. And so that brings obviously a lot of capital to how we might be able to be leaders in different organizations and workplaces and spaces, because we might also do other activities outside of our work, like more community-oriented work. And so we're really good at having those necessary leadership and motivational skills to get people to work together. So I would say for Black, Indigenous women of colour to really ground into that, and how powerful it is to be able to navigate the world with the lens that we have that crosses cultures. The other thing that I would say is also the transformational aspect. I have found, working with Black, Indigenous women of colour coaches and leaders and peers and colleagues, I have found that to be a really powerful experience. The transformation is just so incredible. It's not just obviously the relatability of our experiences and those different layers, but it's just the transformation that comes from working with another woman of colour, and the power and the passion that is infused into the way they lead and mentor and coach us, as well as the way we get to lead, coach and mentor in our own work. So yeah, the transformation and the cultural competency are the two things I most would like to highlight as being really strong leadership traits that women of colour have.
I love it. I love that you're doing that work and amplifying and centering the experiences of women of color is, I think, I don't know, just hearing you speak, it just sounds like, yes, that's wonderful. That's perfect. That's necessary. And so I'm so glad that you're doing that work. And I would definitely put the links to everything in the show notes for people to check out.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharyn, so much for sharing your thoughts with me today. And thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you for having me on your show, Thaís.
Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thaís Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.